If you're a fan of science fiction, if you like a good horror story, or if you're looking for a novel you simply cannot put down, look no further. This is The Replican, the debut novel from author Joseph McCann. The post-punk era, 1979, and English new wave band Tubeway Army were in the studios to record what was to be their second and final album. This was to be a punk album, as they were contracted to do. Whilst in the studio, Gary Newman, lead singer and the sole songwriter for the band, discovered a Moog synthesizer sitting in the corner. He asked if it could be borrowed. The answer was yes, and he started to experiment with sounds from the synthesizer that would complement the arrangements he'd made for the second album. Gary Newman created a sound all of his own by distorting the sounds from the synthesizer through guitar pedals. Newman wrote lyrics for this album that told a story, taking inspiration from the novel he was planning to write but never finished. Replicas developed into a loose concept album set in a not too distant future metropolis where Macman, androids with cloned human skin, and other machines kept the general public cowed down on orders from the Grey Men, whilst down in the park, killing machines played kill by numbers. This new futuristic sound, coupled with the machine-like stage persona that Gary Newman adopted and often later referred to as the Newmanoid, coupled with dark, disturbing stories being told through the songs of a dark, dystopian future world, proved to be a winning formula that captivated the imagination of a generation. Joseph McCann, an unashamed, lifelong Gary Newman fan, was one of those captured in his own imagination by the images the lyrics of the songs placed there. Newman's success is well documented right through to this very day, but the book that inspired the Replicas album was never finished. Never finished until now, that is. Huge Newman fan, Joseph McCann, taking his inspiration from Phil Dick and the novel Bird Box by Josh Malerman, McCann could feel his creative juices beginning to rise. It was whilst reading Malerman's dark sci-fi novel to his daughter Mia, down in the park incidentally, that McCann felt driven to give up the day job and focus on writing the dark sci-fi horror he knew he had inside of him. And in doing so, he has brought Newman's characters to life in a way only McCann could, finishing the novel Newman never did, in homage to his musical hero, whilst launching his own career as a writer. If this debut novel is anything to go by, McCann's career as an author can only go from strength to strength, as McCann is a talented storyteller with a dark and vivid imagination. So what is the novel all about? Well, here's the official teaser released by Joseph McCann in support of the launch of the book. We'll follow this by some excerpts from the novel and a review. Take a look at this. Replican is a dark science fiction horror set in a not too distant dystopian future. It tells the story of the central character, the Replican, as he travels through this disturbing future world in search of his true identity. The Replican is never what he seems. Is he an android? Is he a Macman? Is he human? Or is he an alien? This story twists and turns as the Replican's story progresses. The book is dark, imaginative, funny, sad and horrific in equal measure. The story is enthralling and gripping, a gripping read that you will find very difficult to put down. As soon as McCann began to describe each scene, each character, I knew instantly what they looked like in my mind. As a novelist, McCann has the unrivaled ability to paint pictures in your mind with his words. Words that swirl, develop and grow in your imagination as you read them, until they ultimately create images in your mind's eye. Add to this McCann's uncanny ability to tell a great story, building the suspense from the start right through to the end of every chapter, in a way that makes it impossible to resist the temptation to read just one more page. Here are a number of extracts from chapter 1. I don't want to give away too much of the story, but it demonstrates the point I've just made and emphasises the way that McCann builds a picture in your mind better than anyone else.
He stumbled out from the chamber into the stale evening air, looking back over his shoulder as a huge metal door firmly shut behind him. He took a moment to try and adjust his eyes. He felt as if he'd fallen from a very bright place into this blackness. Even the shadows around him were now being swallowed up by the darkness. A beautiful darkness. He started pushing his way through the undergrowth. Only the faintest of light shone through the leaves. His left arm was in severe pain and his heart was pounding in his chest. He felt a shortness of breath and a dizziness like he'd never felt before. He was so desperate to escape. The need was overwhelming, but from what? He stood, frozen to the spot in the undergrowth for a few moments. I don't know what I'm doing outside, he thought. He could hear water dripping behind him somewhere. A continuous hollow dripping sound impossible to ignore. He had bumped his head on the way out of wherever he'd just appeared from. He had no idea as to where that chamber led to, or from, or why he was so intent on escaping it. He looked over his shoulder at the chamber to try and spark some kind of memory. The door of the chamber was immense. It had to have been over 1 metre thick and was well concealed within the undergrowth, in an area he instantly recognised as the park. The park was a vast area, acres of the only remaining greenery left in the city, surrounded by heavy Victorian cast-iron railings. A huge arched red neon sign above the entrance simply read, "The Park." The park was once a place of peace and tranquility, where children would often play, but the laughter of children in this park had died a long time ago. This dark, menacing park suits the eerie gloom it holds inside. Years ago, it would have been surrounded by pleasant eating and drinking places. These had now become more ominous and sinister, a constant reminder of how easily the park itself turned on everyone. At zero bars, customers would drink heavily into the very early hours of the morning, and every night, someone would be picked out to have their lives ended beside the gates of the park. Mr. Smith, the barman, would happily serve drinks to those that would soon become the park's latest unwilling victims. The Replican looked around the lobby area. He saw row upon row of mailboxes. He recognized his mailbox. Room 8, top floor. He had snapped the key in the lock months ago, and there, protruding from the lock, was indeed half of the key which had rendered his mailbox useless. For him, memories felt as though they were only dripping into his heavy mind. I also have a phone that never rings, he thought to himself, as he turned towards the staircase, pleased that he had finally remembered something. As he turned towards the staircase, from his point of view he could see the couple had crossed the road once more, and they were now back on the park side. It was very dangerous to walk on the park side at night. Anything could pull you in from beyond those railings. He could also see that in the fog and dust outside, that someone was following them. He was a very tall, well-built man, long coat, grey hat. He followed them, staying particularly close. The Replican had no doubt that this figure sticking to the shadows, trailing them, was a Magman. The Magmen were built to be inside the park with all the other machines, hearing noises and screams that no one should ever hear. However, Magmen were incredibly intelligent machines, masters of intimidation, and were far better suited to be used in the outside world, away from the trappings of the park. Everyone feared them. Most felt safe in the city, with the luminous white lighting panels. But as power sources diminished, more and more of our lighting simply faded away. Most felt safe in their apartments, hearing the chants of death, death, death in the depths of the park. There was a photo of himself in some sort of underground tunnel. It was a dark, eerie photograph, black eyeliner and spiky blonde hair. The edges of the photo were heavily weathered. It reminded him that this had been taken a long time ago, before the machines and greys came. The Replican sat staring at the photograph for what seemed like a lifetime, but they offered up nothing to him. He heard more intense screams coming from the park. Machines had pleasure in toying with us. No doubt someone had got far too close to the gates before they met their bitter end. That's when the Replican caught sight of him. As he was looking out across at the glowing neon sign, he noticed a figure off to the right, just across the road. There stood on the sidewalk, amongst the clearing of dust and fog, was a man in a long coat, grey hat, smoking a cigarette. Ahead of the Magman, the sharp shadow of a lamppost had faded into the darkness of the street he stood on. It was a Magman, the same one that followed the couple earlier, he thought. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise when he realized that the Magman was stood staring directly up at the Replican. The Replican retreated out of the light, so he could no longer be seen by him. He backed up towards his bed near the window. "What or whom is he here for?" he said, now feeling safely hidden from his view. A few uneasy minutes went by, and the Replican edged up carefully towards the window to see if the Magman was still outside on the street. The Magman was nowhere to be seen. He had gone. Into the park, perhaps? He looked up and down the street from his window. He saw scattered newspapers, street lamps, and yet he had no idea where the Magman had gone. The park fell silent for a while, and, from where he stood, the view and peaceful silence he felt made him feel almost normal again. In another time this park would have been so beautiful, it would have been so pleasurable to relax there. He could, in that moment, briefly forget the nightmares that were waiting outside. But then, out of the silence, there was a knock at the door.
For this to be an honest and balanced review, it's important to point out the book's faults as well. For me, there are two. The overwhelmingly high use of the word park. Very difficult to avoid, I understand that in the context of the story. But at times it does become very repetitive, and that takes away from the reading of the story. The biggest criticism I would level at this, and it's more of a constructive criticism to help Joe McCann in the future, is that he plays to his strengths just a little bit too much. He's really, really good at painting images in your mind, so he's using a lot of narrator's voice to tell the story. What I'd like to see in any subsequent novels that come following this first debut novel would be for the characters to tell the story for him. And that would be for him to use less author's voice and more character dialogue to tell the story on his behalf. That would make the story even more immersive and even more enthralling than it already is. The novel, The Replican, is out now. It's available from any branch of Waterstones, through Amazon and through eBay. You can also contact Joe McCann directly via his Facebook page. I'll put the links into the comments section at the bottom of this. I hope you've enjoyed this review, and I do hope that you'll support Joe and give this book a read. Thoroughly recommended. Thank you for listening.